This is Nick Wright with Managing Editor Zachary Fillingham of Geopoliticalmonitor.com. And today we're going to be talking about Mexico-U.S. relations, in particular what appears to be a new and ongoing trade war with Mexico. And this relates to an article on the website that you can check out entitled Mexico, a New Front in the Trump Trade War. So Zach, tell us a little bit about Donald Trump's recent announcement and what impacts it's likely to have.
Okay, so President Trump, as we know, has threatened to institute new tariffs on Mexico. The tariffs will start at 5% on June 10th. They'll raise to 10% on July 1st, and then they'll max out at 25% in October. His reason for doing it is he believes that Mexico is not doing enough to stem the flow of migrants coming from Central American countries through Mexico and then into the United States.
So Zach, it's an interesting question. These caravans of people coming from frequently countries other than Mexico, Guatemala or other Central or even South American nations. Why is it that Mexico hasn't been doing more to prevent these caravans from coming into the United States?
Well, I mean, it's a question of what Mexico is able to do, right? So if we look at a country like the United States, it has a long border with Mexico. The United States, the largest economy in the world, has lots of resources available to it, yet it still struggles to find a solution to its own border problem along its border with Mexico, right? It's become a political issue lately. There's discussions of a border wall. There's huge amount of apprehensions, huge amount of border guard presence along that border. Yet it is still a quote unquote crisis in the words of President Trump. So now you take Mexico, you apply all the same circumstances to Mexico, which is about 1/16 the size of the American economy. So obviously it has a lot less resources with which to do all these things. This is not to excuse, this is not to say that Mexico's doing enough or not doing enough. It's just to sort of highlight the issue that Mexico has the same problems that the United States does with its own southern border, and it has a lot less resources with which to work with.
And what are both the United States and Mexico doing in order to address the issue?
Okay, so, along the border, we know the United States has been, we know broadly what the United States is doing. If we follow the arc of the Trump presidency, everything from child separations to the potential building of a border wall, to the increase of the border guard presence, to the sort of increasing impossibility of asylum actually being granted. However, the Trump administration has certain legal hurdles it has to deal with in stemming the flow. One of them is the fact that if you can, if you declare asylum or you apply for asylum in the United States, you can remain in the United States under the assumption that you're going to show up for your hearing. Obviously, not everybody does that. They get rejected, but then they sort of disappear into the ether. One system that they're trying to work out between the two of them now is that asylum applicants to the United States would stay in Mexico. So if they were ultimately rejected, they would not be within the United States. They would not gain entry to the United States. So Mexico, along its own first of all, this is the core root of this problem is the fact that the Central American governments are some of these countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. There's somewhat of a breakdown in the economic political order. People are fleeing sort of violence and to a lesser degree have absolutely no economic prospects. It's creating an increasing flow of migrants northward. And the border between Mexico and Guatemala, for example, is about 700 miles. It goes through rugged terrain, jungles, etc. So it's very hard to police. Like I said before, Mexico doesn't necessarily have the resources with which to do it. Because you're either building a huge wall, which is, as we know from the American debate right now, it's an expensive proposition, or you are deploying a large amount of your security forces along the southern border, which is also an expensive proposition. But also, Mexico has to deal with an ongoing near civil war caliber insurgency in the form of the drug war, where essentially, long story short, its security forces are required elsewhere to fight that war. And also, as these migrants potentially build up within Mexico, it creates a sort of separate security issue for the Mexican government insofar that they're not necessarily going to go back south. Some of them are going to fall prey to these same drug and criminal networks that are creating such a long-term problem within Mexico. And so basically, there's the possibility that it will further accentuate some of Mexico's serious pre-existing security issues.
And what's Trump doing, and is his plan likely to work?
Okay, so basically, what Trump is doing is it's something new. It's exceptional. Basically, these tariffs we're kind of becoming numb to the sort of sound bites of the Trump presidency: tariffs here, tariffs there, tariffs everywhere. But to this point, the tariffs have all had some sort of, like, whether it's true or not, they've all had the logic that Trump is rectifying unfair trade practices. If you take or national security. So those are the two kind of exceptions in international trade law. He's not going through the actual adjudicators of international trade law like the World Trade Organization. He's making all the decisions himself, but he's still clothing his decisions in the language of international trade law. So China is an unfair player. China is doing all these trade practices that give it an unfair advantage, so I'm going to slap on these tariffs. Canadian steel and aluminum is a national security threat. Okay, but so we're going to slap on these tariffs. This is sort of exceptional in the sense that you're trying to achieve a very specific political end. You want Mexico to change its immigration policy. And to do so, you're wielding your disproportionate economic leverage over that country, in my opinion, in a way that could be considered bullying that country. So I think that it's really interesting in a sort of historical perspective to look back on this, because when you think of international free trade, it's sort of conducted on the basis of a kind of mutual understanding that things like this wouldn't happen. You allow another country to produce things that are essential to your economy because that country can do it more efficiently and produce cost benefits for you. But if you start to believe that the supply of said item could be stopped at any point for any political reason, because this country, which is bigger than you, doesn't like something that you're doing politically, then you might sort of start to turn your back on the concept of free trade and produce things, adopt a more autarkic stance or a self-sustaining, self-contained trade or economy, because even if you produce said item less efficiently and more expensively and with less, whiz-bang technology, at least you have that guarantee that you can produce that item. You're not at the, you're victim of the whim of whoever your trading partner is. So I think that's an interesting sort of broad, long-term consideration in all this. Another interesting consideration is that the tariffs are across the board. They're not targeting any specific export or import. They're on everything. So again, that's very extreme reaction. So that's the first part. To answer your second part of why he's doing this now, Basically, the problem at the U.S. border is reaching ahead in terms of numbers. The number of apprehensions in April was around 109,000, which is the highest number since 2007. I don't think that's so much a reflection of policy failures on the U.S. or even Mexican part. It could also just be a reflection of the severity of the crisis from Central America and the fact that you have many more people fleeing from a much worse situation than existed before. So why is he doing it now? There's that, and it's obviously, as much of Trump's foreign policy, it's definitely should be viewed through the lens of domestic politics and how Trump wants to brand himself moving into 2020, or basically maintain his brand.
And do you think it will be effective?
Well, it's hard to say, whether or not the plan will be effective. As I just said before, you might have these sort of diffuse long-term considerations that are ultimately to the detriment of U.S. interests, U.S. trade interests, U.S. economic interests, because this administration in particular seems to be ignoring the kind of economic dogma that has informed all the administrations before it, basically the need to develop and secure export markets, right? I think some of these moves, they jeopardize that sort of long-term goal. But in the short term, I think Trump's approach definitely gets the attention of the Mexican government. It's the last thing that President Obrador wants to deal with right now, because he's been very focused on his own domestic agenda. He has a lot of goals he set for himself in alleviating poverty and providing better social welfare in Mexico. Obviously, Mexican presidents only get five years with which to implement their agenda. They cannot stand for re-election. And so he needs, right now, he basically needs to oblige Trump out of his own economic necessity, because these tariffs can be potentially extremely damaging to the Mexican economy. But he still needs to walk his own fine political line, because he needs to make sure that he doesn't appear too acquiescent in the face of U.S. bullying. He has also sort of made his own political brand around respect for the poor and respecting the human rights of Central American migrants moving through Mexico. So there's that too. However, like I said, the stakes are so high for Obrador that he needs to do something. And even in the days following the Trump announcement, we're already seeing a series of sort of symbolic gestures from the Mexican authorities. We're seeing a ramping up of raids along the Guatemala border, the detaining of migrants and the breaking up of caravans, sort of ad hoc examples of it. But like I said, it's always going to be a question of operational resources, right? So I think the political will is there in terms of the Mexican authorities, but there's a question of what they're able to do, right? So and the fact that these tariffs themselves will start to impact the resources available to the Mexican authorities. So in a bizarre sense, it's like Trump is harming. Like, he might secure the political will, but his policy is also harming their capacity to do what he wants them to do. And I think that the challenges represented by that southern border shouldn't be understated. I mean, like, you can see the U.S. border is the same thing. It's a hard problem to solve.
And has the U.S. government been clear on what specifically they want Mexico to do?
No, I think that like, if you were to sort of draft a playbook of Trumpian foreign policy, this would be in it. They haven't been clear, and I mean, the good thing about that is it always allows for an escape route for the Trump administration if the sort of negative consequences become too much, like, so. there's always been a bit of try and see with this administration. So you put that out there. Obviously, the decision making seems to be very on the spot. Because Trump advisors are seldomly consulted about the policies that the president rolls out. So I think in not being specific about what they want, they allow themselves to pull out of it at any time, because there's the considerable economic stakes here, right? So, for example, if you start to see serious problems in the stock market or more indications of a U.S. recession, then you could, for example, take these raids along the Guatemalan border as an indication that the Mexicans are being more serious about policing the border, and then you can cancel the tariffs. We've seen threats like this before. The Trump administration has threatened to close the southern border with Mexico before. That never happened. On the other hand, if you start being specific about what you want and you set the bar too high, it puts you in a bad position if the Mexicans refuse to oblige or ultimately are unable to do what you want. So I think they haven't been specific. It's pretty much what they've been doing with all of these trade wars, but it's probably the better way to do it. If you have specific demands, it's better to deliver them behind closed doors, because it eliminates some of the wider political dynamics in democratic societies.
So what exactly are the political and economic stakes here? What will likely happen to the economy if these tariffs are implemented as proposed?
Well, I think the stakes are pretty high, and you can see it in the way that Wall Street responds to the news. There's just like a barrage of negative takes and negative projections and op-eds. So basically, it's kind of a different beast than the China trade war, because in Mexico you have an economy that's highly integrated with the American economy, and that is the result of decades of free trade under NAFTA, right? So you have supply chains that are highly integrated between the two. You have in the manufacturing of one end product, like whether it's a car or an appliance, you have certain parts that travel several times across the border for sort of compartmentalized assembly. And if you implement across the board tariffs, obviously the production of an item will get dinged at every point, right? Like the parts that go into it. So you have and also basically even the protectionists advocate the more protectionist minded people, pundits, observers, experts, officials. They advocate for the development of a more regional economic bloc, right? Because obviously the U.S. economy needs to export somewhere. So they look to Canada and Mexico as sort of retrenching from the global economy, doubling down on the Americas. So this flies in the face of that. And it also flies in the face of a lot of corporate attempts to diversify their own production away from China, because they're reading the writing on the wall, and they're seeing that over the long term, the U.S.-Chinese trade relationship might remain contentious. So they're relocating their operations to Mexico as an alternative low-cost production hub that presumably has continued unimpeded access to the U.S. market, and this is hitting them hard. So obviously there's a lot of potential hurt for Mexico here. 80% of the country's exports go to the United States. These exports were worth $350 billion in 2018. The Mexican economy is not in good shape as it stands. It experienced a 0.2% contraction at the start of 2019. And Mexico is the second largest exporter of goods to the USA, behind China. So that puts it ahead of Canada. It's a serious trading partner of the United States. And it's not just Mexican exports going to the United States. Mexico buys about 19 billions worth of food exports from the U.S. Producers, primarily corn, soybeans, beef, and dairy products. Mexico is the top foreign market for USA dairy products. And, U.S. farmers and agricultural producers they're already reeling from the China tariffs, right? Because China represented a lucrative market for their exports, particularly soy. And so they're already suffering. They were under tariffs for both Mexico and Canada because of reciprocal tariffs after the aluminum and steel tariffs, which were recently lifted. So they just got their access back to Mexico, and now it looks like it will probably be restricted again from expected counter tariffs from the Mexican government. So yeah, and finally another thing is that I think that there's a real potential for it to hurt the passage of the U.S. Mexican-Canada trade agreement, the successor to NAFTA, which was already running into a lot of problems. Basically, the agreement hasn't come into force yet, and it won't come into force until legislation is passed in all three countries. So it's still tentative. So long as it doesn't come into force, we're still under NAFTA trade rules. So the Democrat-controlled Congress is trying to reopen negotiations. They ultimately have the power as whether it passes or does not in the House of Representatives. Obviously, this might throw up some roadblocks in Mexico because it's just generally not a good look, right? The ink hasn't dried on your North American free trade agreement, which you yourself, as an administration, negotiated, and you're already leveraging unilateral tariffs on one of your supposed partners to achieve a direct political aim. So yeah, I would say that the economic stakes are pretty high in all this.
Fascinating. And any expectations in the short term as to how this will unfold?
Okay, so I think that probably two forces will dictate, generally speaking, the course of future events. One will be the ongoing problem at the border, or the ongoing number of arrivals at the U.S. border, and as we've discussed, there's no real quick fix to that. Regardless of Mexican political will, it might continue to be a problem. A lot of that has to do with like the state of Central American countries, and in that, I mean, just to touch down on that, if you are of the opinion that stabilizing these countries is the best way to stem the flow of migrants out of them, then there's a lot to be depressed about, because the U.S. administration has not been concerned about addressing the root problems that is sending the migrants out. Quite the contrary, it has, for example, been threatening to cut aid to these countries and basically cut economic engagement to these countries, basically accentuate the problem that's sending people northward. So yeah, and the second thing to keep an eye on would probably be like indications of economic harm from these tariffs. A key pressure point that we've seen time and time again with the Trump administration is what it does to the U.S. stock market. So if we see if we see major detrimental effects on the U.S. stock market, if we see stock market plunge, then I think that there is a higher chance that the Trump administration will take its sort of unspecified leave, right? Be like, well, they've done a lot to increase border security, so we're going to cancel the tariffs. Another thing to keep an eye on as an economic signifier would be any and all pain in the U.S. agricultural sector. Obviously, a large, important part of the Trump base, and as I mentioned before, economically they've already been suffering. I think a lot of them are starting to sort of tire of the trade wars. They're getting trade war fatigue, and they've also received a lot of government subsidies to sort of alleviate their pain. So that's something to keep an eye out on, and I guess sort of future possibilities. There might be a rate cut. I think the Federal Reserve. I think it's increased odds that we'll see a rate cut from the Federal Reserve, which has been flagging trade tensions as a possible source of disruption in the U.S. economy for a while now. So they get their further disruption, further reason for a rate cut. Which, I mean, I guess if you're thinking 5D chess, maybe that was Trump's intention all along. But so yeah, and I'll actually. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Go if you want to go by the Goldman Sachs predictions. The Goldman Sachs economists they see a 70% chance that I would love to know how they come up with that 70%. They see a 70% chance that the tariffs are applied on June 10th, and a 50% chance of them reaching 10% on July 1st. They've also downgraded the odds that the USMCA trade agreement will pass this year from the original 60% to 35%. They've also cut their U.S. growth forecast from 2.5% to 2%. So, yeah, Goldman Sachs, some negative sentiment there. So, yeah, I think that's basically what we should look out for moving forward.
Fascinating. Well, thanks so much, Zac, for this informative overview of Mexican tariffs that the U.S. has proposed to implement. To our listeners, you can check out the article on the website. Again, it's Mexico, a New Front in the Trump Trade War. And you can visit that article at Geopoliticalmonitor.com. So thank you all for listening, and talk to you next time.